Today we're continuing our study series on the 7 deadly sins, and we're nearing the end. So some of you are probably going, thank goodness we're getting close to the end. We've looked so far, going down our wasp leg: wrath, avarice, sloth, pride, lust. Today we're covering envy, and next week gluttony, and then we're done. Our sermon series after that will be on first things. So it'll be a look at the Christian virtue of simplicity, focusing on the one thing so that everything else falls into its right place around it. I've been telling you all along that, sin is really the sickness. It's disobedience, rejection, denial of God, and rebellion against God. It's the sickness, and then these individual sins are the manifestation or the symptoms of sin in our lives. As we're looking today at envy, you're probably wondering, well, what do we mean by when we say that? People sometimes say it's jealousy, coveting. They're all related words. Envy is the broader term that includes all of those. Jealousy refers, of course, more to romantic or emotional relationships. Coveting has more to do with things. Envy really covers the broad spectrum of them all. And it's been defined, this is the dictionary definition, as a feeling of sadness or resentment towards someone else's good fortune or success. That's pretty mild. It's usually stronger than that. It's an inappropriate and destructive desire to have what another person has. So it's not admiration. I could see something and go, wow, that's wonderful. I could celebrate it with you. It's not that. It's seeing what you have and feeling kind of diminished by what you have and wanting it in a destructive way, destructive to you and destructive to me. I'm going to, later on, after we look at our scripture passage for today, I'm going to challenge you. I'm challenging you now. I'm going to ask you then again, what passage would you think of in the Bible that would be one that would be an example of envy? All right? I'm challenging you to think about that. After we go through this one, we're going to ask you that. So here's the passage we're looking at, Genesis 37. It's the story of Joseph and the coat of many colors. Okay, except it wasn't really a coat of many colors. We'll talk about that as we go through it. Anyhow, this is a story that's part of the story of the patriarchs. Abraham was given a promise by God that he was going to inherit a land and have many descendants. That promise was passed on to his son Isaac, and from there it went to his son Jacob. And now it's gone to these 12 sons of Jacob, who are, wow, it's an interesting choice because these are not the most stellar individuals. In fact, as we look at this story, we're going to go, why would God's promise go to people like these? And we wonder the same thing today. Why people like us? There's a famous prayer that Jews say every morning when they wake up, and part of it says, why the Jews? Why us? Who are we? And we could say the same prayer. Why us? Why have we been called to be in a saving relationship with Jesus Christ? Well, here's the story. Chapter 37, verse 1. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. Canaan is just the name for Palestine in the ancient world. It was a name that came from the sea peoples on the coast. They would crush it means literally land of purple. They would crush the seashells there and make them into a dye that was purple, hence the name. They were living in the land of Canaan. And then it says, this is the account of Jacob's family line. So if you want to know about Jacob and his family, this is the story. And then it says, Joseph, a young man of 17. Well, what you know about Joseph was that he was the son of Jacob and Rachel, his favorite wife. And you remember he has 2 wives and 2 handmaids that are sometimes called wives, but are really kind of slaves that they're, wow, I don't even know where to go with this. It's just an ugly kind of story, the way they have these 4 women that are involved, and they all have all these children, and they're all competing with one another and vying for his attention and favor. So he has this incredibly mixed up, and I would say dysfunctional family. And we have Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah. And don't name your children after those. If you're looking for biblical names, avoid Bilhah and Zilpah. And they're called here his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report about them. So he's 17 years old. He's out working with his older brothers. They're all older than him at this time. And as he goes out, he sees their work, and he comes back and he tells Dad that they're not doing their job. Now, I'm sure everybody loved that. They've got to love the fact that he's the favorite son. As we're going to hear, he makes absolutely clear to everybody repeatedly. They're the older brothers, and yet they are subordinate to him in their dad's affection and in the responsibility he gives for the work of their caring for their livestock. So it's a pretty bad situation. And we wonder what Joseph is thinking about here. I got a picture of Joseph. We always are curious about what it looks like. It's got his coat of many colors. That's actually not what it means. That's based on a translation from a Greek manuscript. The original words are kind of hard to determine, but we think it means long-sleeved. Not long this way, but long this way. The idea is that Dad is giving him a coat that you can't work in, right? You get the idea? He's given a three-piece suit while his brothers are given dungarees and, and overalls. That's the point. They're the peons who are going to be doing the work. He's the important guy who doesn't. So he goes out, and is he just naive and is doing this? I don't know what to tell you. He is 17, so maybe he doesn't fully get it. But now we hear these words. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made an ornate robe for him. And we got a picture now of I'm going to show you just the robe, him giving that and showing how important he is. And imagine if he's going around wearing all this all the time. It's really a message to everybody, physical and obvious, of who Dad thinks is important. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. So there is jealousy and envy obvious in the family. And Joseph, what do they say? My wife always works in the hospital, and she always says, they have a saying there, don't poke the bear. And they actually had a guy who was hospitalized there because he poked a bear. No kidding. He shot this bear and was wondering if it was dead, so he came up and poked it. It wasn't dead. And don't poke the bear, but that's what he's going to do here. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, listen to this dream I had. And remember, dreams were a common way for people. People felt God was speaking to them through these dreams. People still do today, but very common back then. Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright while your sheaves gathered round mine and bowed down to it. Well, you don't have to be much of an interpreter of dreams to see what that story means. And we got another picture of that too, just so you see. There they all bowing down to him. His brothers said to him, do you intend to reign over us? Do you think you're going to be the one ruling over us? That's the idea, like a king. Will you actually rule us? And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. So things are going from bad to worse. Then he had another dream. You'd think he would be learning his lesson here. And again, is he naive or is he deliberately just going after him because he's so sure of his power and strength? He had another dream, and he told to his brothers, listen, he said, I had another dream, and this time the sun and the moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me. Now, in that illustration, who are the sun and the moon? Mom and Dad. And everybody's going to pick up on that. When he told his father as well as his brothers, see, Jacob was okay with it being, the brothers, but now that it's about him, his father rebuked him and said, what is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come down and bow to the ground before you? And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Okay, so Dad's thinking about it. Now his brothers had gone to graze their flocks near Shechem, and Israel said to Joseph, Israel is another name for Jacob. You remember, it means one who wrestles with God. It was his other name. As you know, your brothers are grazing the flocks near Shechem. Come, I'm going to send you to them. Very well, he replied. And I've got a map to show you what we're talking about here. You notice that they're living down by Hebron, which is quite a ways, and 50 miles to the north of them is Shechem. That's quite a distance. And then we're going to find that they're not actually there. They're at this place called Dothap there that you can see a little further up. So this is about 70 miles away. And it lets you know how unpopulated this region must have been at that time, that they could just let their livestock go over such a large area. We had a Charles Wolfkill. Some of you might remember Charles, but his family, when he was a kid, they would actually have cattle here in Eagle and take them up to Long Valley to pasture in the summertime, right? That was kind of interesting. I think that's that recent for us here. A member that some of you might remember. Anyhow, he said to him, go and see if all is well with your brothers and with the flocks, and bring word back to me. Then he sent him off from the valley of Hebron. When Joseph arrived at Shechem, a man found him wandering around in the fields and asked him, what are you looking for? Notice how loose this is? In the day of cell phones, we can't imagine something like this, but go there, look, and he's just hanging around. Oh, they've moved on. He replied, I'm looking for my brothers. Can you tell me where they are grazing their flocks? They have moved on from here, the man answered. I heard them say, let's go to Dothan. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan, but they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Wow. My brothers always joked about this. They never actually did it. And these guys are going to follow through. There's that much hatred and animosity. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. And you can imagine how much they just like that whole message. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. He dreamt that he was going to rule over us. If we kill him, that can't happen. So that's their plan. And they're going to throw him in a cistern. A cistern is something that collects water. And of course, ancient Israel was totally dependent on rainfall. They can't irrigate back there because the Jordan River is below sea level and too salty. And so if you use that to irrigate, yes, you could drink it, but if you use it to irrigate, it will over time poison and salinate the land. So cisterns are important, but they're dry at this time. They're going to get rid of his body and hide it this way so that nobody can find it and locate it. That's a terrible plan, right? When Reuben heard this, he tried to rescue him from their hands. So he's one of the oldest brothers, and he says, let's not take his life, he said. Don't shed any blood. Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him. So notice his plan. Let's not kill him. Let's just leave him in this deep pit and say goodbye. And if he dies, he dies. It's not our fault. Wow, that's a big improvement. But we're told, and I don't know how we know this, but the narrator says, Reuben said this to rescue him from them and take him back to his father. So he had a plan in mind to rescue him. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the ornate robe he was wearing, and they took him and threw him into the cistern. And the cistern was empty and there was no water in it. We got a picture of him being thrown into the cistern. They were actually at the bottom of the cistern. And you can get an idea there. It would be not something you could easily get out of. This is just one example. And I don't know if any of you have ever been to see some of the cisterns of the ancient world. Some are very huge. The most famous one, I think, is in Istanbul, where it's been in so many James Bond movies and other movies. You've seen it without knowing you were there. They're huge sometimes, and they're deep. And he's going to get thrown in there. He's thrown in there. And then, notice what they do next. Verse 25. As they sat down to eat their meal, oh my gosh, let's throw our brother in the pit, and then let's have a picnic. They looked up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead. Now, they're called Ishmaelites. They're called Midianites. We don't know. There seems to be some confusion about it. Their camels were loaded with spices, balm, and myrrh, and they were on their way to take them down to Egypt. So they're just passing through these traders. And Judah said to his brothers, what will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood. Wow. He's our brother. Let's sell him as a slave. That's much better than killing him. His brothers agreed. So now they have a chance to make a few bucks off of him. So when the Midianite merchants came by, his brothers pulled Joseph up out of the cistern and sold him for 20 shekels of silver to the Ishmaelites who took him to Egypt. Now what's surprising about that is the price. And I've got several pictures of this because it's interesting how do you picture him? How young is he? How small? How strong? Let's see another one. There he's older and, stronger looking and desperate there, right? Anyhow, the picture here is 20 shekels of silver. The price for a slave, if you accidentally damage someone's slave, you're supposed to pay 30 pieces of silver, which is why we have that price paid for Jesus when he died on the cross. To pay to Judas. Why is it 20 here? Because that's how much they think of him. He's hardly worth anything. My brothers did joke a lot about selling me to various individuals and groups for various prices, and usually not very much. Maybe we could get a used stick of gum for you or something like that. Anyhow, that's what they do here. They sell them for a below price. When Reuben returned to the cistern and saw that Joseph was not there, he tore his clothes. So he wasn't a part of this conversation. He went back to his brothers and said, the boy isn't there. Where can I turn now? Then they got Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, dipped the robe in the blood. They took the ornate robe back to their father and said, we found this. Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe. And notice how they put that? Your son's robe, not our brother's robe. He recognized it, and he said, it is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces. And we have a picture of that, too, of him mourning. Then Jacob tore his clothes, put on sackcloth, and mourned for his son many days, and all his sons and daughters came to comfort him. But he refused to be comforted. No, he said, I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave. So his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites sold Joseph in Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Well, that's not a very pleasant story, is it? Much better than the story we had last week, though, so we're all kind of rejoicing about that, right? Before we talk about what this passage means, I'm going to challenge you, though. What other passages would you think of to talk about envy? And don't go to the Ten Commandments. I'm looking for a story. Yes?
So could we take Herod's, the passage that talks about Herod wanting the wise men to tell him where the Christ child is so he can go worship him when he really...
Okay, so the story of King Herod, he's envious of this new king that's arisen there. Okay, that's one. Anybody else?
John Samaritan's.
Oh, sorry?
The Good Samaritan's brother. Not the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son's brother.
Yeah, the prodigal son's brother. That's definitely one of envy. Yes, someone over here? Yeah, Carol?
Cain and Abel.
Cain and Abel. Okay.
And Jacob and Esau.
Jacob and Esau. Okay. And we could go with others. What's interesting is, as you think of them, almost everyone, another one would be the disciples fighting between one another. Who's going to be greatest in the kingdom and the envy they have with one another? Almost all the stories we think of envy in the Bible, and perhaps in life, begin with family. Just challenge you to think about that. That's an interesting thing. I'm going to suggest to you that envy often does begin in the home, right? And envy is often, well, it is by definition, it is comparative and competitive. It's all based on what somebody else has that I want, and it's all based on competition, okay? Envy starts at home. Remember, we said it's a feeling of sadness or resentment towards someone else's good fortune or success, and it is an inappropriate desire to have what another has, competitive and comparative. Like all sins, it's destructive. First, it destroys the happiness of the person who envies. Second, it is often horribly and unfairly destructive of the one who is envied. Look at our story there today. You know, Joseph is envied, so we're going to kill him or sell him as a slave because we want him out of the picture. Once he's gone, we'll win. We'll have what we want, our father's affection. As in today's lesson, it usually springs from a sense of injustice and unfairness, either real or perceived. So that was in today's story, right? He really did favor this one son over another. And I think all of us have been in situations where we have seen people who really do favor, or parents or grandparents or others. I have one distant relative who was, his mom died and then his father remarried, and wow, they could not have made it clearer. They would, his stepsisters and brothers would have mounds of presents on Christmas, and he'd get one. And if one of their toys broke, they'd actually take his and give it. Ugh, you know, imagine how you feel growing up in a place like that. We often talk in the church about how we were created to be in relationship with God, and that if we're not in that relationship, there's something missing in our lives. We quote Augustine where he said, something there is that will not find its rest until it finds its rest in thee. You know, that need we have, that God-sized hole. But there's also a need we have to connect up with other people. If we don't have support and love from family and friends, then where are we? It's part of the reason we think it's so important as a church to come together as a community and a fellowship to recognize and feel that love and support. That God hole we have inside of us can be hard when it's not filled. And so people often will focus on the unfairness and the injustice that they get in affection at home. But it's also challenging because I will tell you, having raised kids and having come from a family of 9, it's impossible to be perfectly fair with children, right? And in a family. I don't know if your kids were like this, but my kids, especially my son Paul, oh my gosh, was he concerned about how fair we were going to be treated, right? He would ask me all the time, well, who do you love more? And I go, oh, you know, I don't want to go there. That's not a good question to ask. Let's go a different way. Then he'd say, well, if there was a fire, who would you pull out first? You know, if the boat overturns and we're out in the water, who are you going to rescue first? And he'd not only wonder about the place of all of his brothers and sisters and him, but also about our dog. You know, are we going to ever rescue the dog? Does that matter? You know, does it come first? I like the dog more than my sisters. You know, that kind of thought was clearly going on. And I would tell him that you know, I know some parents tell you that they love you all equally. I said that's not true for me. I love you all differently. Because you're different people. You have different needs, and I'm trying to meet you where you are. But it's also true that I'm coming from different places, right? And it's also true that sometimes, while I love you, I don't always like you very much, right? And I'm sure there are times you don't like me very much. And then you have different circumstances that are going on in your lives, right? So I'm going to tell you, it's really almost impossible. It's really inevitable you're going to have some differences in how you treat them. I think of things that happen, you know, well, you know, I've got my son Paul, he's a big, strong guy. I'm going to give him different opportunities than I perhaps would my daughter B, who's small. And, you know, well, different person, different skills, different abilities. And boy, I grew up in a family where 9 of us. I'll tell you a story about this, and you'll see it's just, I had a brother just above me. He's 8 years older than me, but he was in a terrible car accident when he was 17 years old, and it left him handicapped a little bit. He has one leg shorter than the other, and he went from being a really stellar athlete to being somebody who, well, he was in a coma for 3.5 weeks. He lost 110 pounds in the hospital. So he just went, I mean, he almost died. And when he came back, he'd lost all his coordination. So I would wrestle him, and it was so interesting. He was favored to win light heavyweight state championship, and I could beat him, barely, you know, at 10. And you go, wow, what a difference that has made. Anyhow, one time, one of my best friends said, there's this hill back there that got burnt right the year before I was born, and it had been overgrown, and nobody ever went on top of this thing because it was surrounded by landowners. And he made a bet with me that I couldn't make to the top of that hill in under an hour. And I said, oh, this is money in the bank. I know I can do that one. And I lost bets to him all the time. So I was really anxious to do this one. I went home and told my mom what I was going to do, and she said, well, yeah, that's fine. And then my 2 brothers said, we want to go with you. And I go, oh, I don't want to take you guys. You'll slow me down. I'm going. And my mom said, take them with you, and don't lose them. Now, understand, this is my 22-year-old brother. I'm 14, right? But I'm in charge. And I was going, well, that's not really fair, but I'm taking them in, okay. We're going on the way up, and we hit this place where it's just all overgrown with brush. And I'm seeing the way through this is to crawl on my belly through the blackberry bushes, right? Yeah, you're all going, I'm going to win that 20. So my little brother says, I'll follow you. And then my other brother says, I'm not going there. And I go, oh, you know, this is not what we agreed on. I said, all right, you go up and try to find us that way. We'll wait for you at the top. And so we crawl through. By the way, I got to tell you, this is one of the scariest things that ever happened to me. It turned out there was a rabbit warren in there. And as we were crawling, the rabbit warren collapsed, and all these rabbits started running over the top of us. And you know, they make that noise like little babies screaming. It's just terrible. I had nightmares about it. I know they're rabbits, but it didn't feel that way. Anyhow, we made it to the top. We're waiting for my brother. He doesn't show. He doesn't show. He doesn't show. And I go, well, he must have given up. We hiked down to the bottom. I'm looking around for him there. He doesn't show. He doesn't show. He doesn't show. Finally, at dark, I go back home with my little brother, and I say, hey, you know, we haven't seen my brother. You know, Rick, is he anywhere around? And my mom says, no, go back and find him. And I'm going, it's dark. She says, I don't care. Don't come back until you find him. I go, okay. We go all the way back there, right? I'm looking around for hours. It is past midnight when I finally say, I can't find him. I come all the way back home, and guess what? My brother had shown up 15 minutes after I left, and he had gotten lost. This hill is within sight of our house. How he could get lost on this thing, I have no idea. But he came down on the other side, which was owned by the Gattenbines. They were dairymen, and they had taken him in, fed him dinner, an extra dinner. He'd already had one. And and then they'd driven him home. And he showed up 15 minutes after me. And I said to my mom, so he showed up 15 minutes after me. Why didn't you send him to find me? She says, why would I do that? And I said, so now look at that. You're probably going, hey, I said to her, what am I, chopped liver, you know? Where's my importance in this family unit here? But My mom, I know, didn't really, she loved me. I know that. It was a concern that she had for him and feeling that I was, and honestly, she was right. I was more competent. I went up the hill and came down the way I was supposed to. I didn't get lost going around the backside. And, I found my way after a few hours. It was all good and okay. That leads me to to thinking about things can seem unfair. Envy is competitive and it looks for those things, and comparative, it looks for the differences. But are they really there? I want you to know I'm not anti-competition. I'm a big believer in competing with people. I love to compete and give things my best. But if our lives are all based on competition and comparison, wow, that's not a good way to live, is it? Win-lose environment that takes place all the time. It's a dangerous trap to have that in our homes and families, to have that be the way we relate to our neighbors and those around us. It's a bad mindset. We all know that it's better to have more of a win-win. If it's all about comparing, that's a bad way, because that's not the way the world really is. It doesn't really matter if your health is good. That doesn't mean my health is bad, right? Or have anything to do with it. It doesn't really matter if you're wealthy and have a nice home. How does that affect me? It doesn't really matter if you are successful to me, right? It doesn't necessarily rub off on me in any negative way. If I focus on comparing, I'll often fail to appreciate what I have. I will focus on what you have. I will focus on what I don't have, or what I think isn't good enough. And that will make me unhappy, right? And it will never end, because there will always be those who will beat you, and because you're focusing on the negative. Let me give you an example. I'm 65 years old. It's safe to say that I'm getting older, slower, and weaker. Once in a while I go up a little bit, but the trend is there, right? My memory isn't as good as it once was. I'm getting uglier. I can see that in the mirror. If I focus on all the things I'm losing, where will I go, right? That's a bummer. And some people will do that. You know people that do it. We talked earlier about people who do those organ recitals, Let me tell you about my liver and But how about focusing on the positive? I'm getting older. I'm getting closer to the kingdom. I'm getting closer to a lot of things that are good and positive in my life, right? What are the positives we can focus on? If it's about competition and winning, here's the really bad part about envy. Then it's not even about me improving. It's about maybe making the other person's life worse. If I destroy what's good and beautiful, then I can win in my mind. So I had a friend in high school who had this beautiful car, one of the nicest cars in town, and I remember we went bowling, and he parked it like a mile away from the bowling alley. And I said, why? And he says, well, the last time I was here, I parked it close, and somebody keyed it. I said, why? Does somebody hate you? He goes, no, some stranger. I think they just didn't like to see my car. See, somebody's got something nice, key it. We finished painting our church in Portland. It was really run down. We painted it all beautiful, and you know what the next thing happened? Somebody spray painted on the outside of it. Why? Because something's getting nicer. When I work with guys in the prison, that's one of the things we hear a lot, So I'm working to change my life and make it better, and people don't want to see that because it makes them somehow feel worse, so they do things to drag other people down. It's a stew of misery sometimes. And we see that envy leads to debt. I'm competing with these other people who have these things, so I have to have them to compete. It leads to bad relationships because we're focused on all this negative and competition. And it leads to problems. And you know where I see it the most as a pastor is in inheritances. Isn't that one of the saddest things? Have you known people who are having an inheritance and their family just gets into huge fights over it? And I know sometimes it's about money, but I can tell you that a lot of times it's not. It's about them settling scores that took place long ago. And it's one of the sad things we see in life. I promised that in this series we wouldn't focus on the negative, so I'm going to lift up some positive things in all this that we can do, virtues and habits and practices that can make a difference. And so here's the first of them. I kind of mentioned it earlier. The first one well, that's sad. That whole page is missing. Well, we will do it anyway. I don't know how that happened. First one would be love. We talked about it earlier, that love covers a multitude of sins, the Bible tells us. But if we live in love and we're really caring about other people, then we don't focus on all the comparison. We're okay to let things go, and we can actually celebrate things. Got another story about that. When I was a kid, my dad would bring home candy bars from the store. He loved to go grocery shopping. That was his favorite thing to do. He owned a store at one point, and he'd bring these treats home, and that was our treat for the day. And there were a lot of us, so we divided up. But here was the bummer. If you were the person that divided it up, that meant you got last choice. The thought was that you wouldn't, you'd have to do it fairly then, right? So that you couldn't cut a big chunk for yourself and get it, you got the last choice. And none of us then wanted to be the one who cut it up and divided it, obviously, because that's a bummer. Except for my sister. My sister Mary loved to do this, right? And she would always volunteer. We thought she was just a wonderful person for doing this. What we didn't know was that if there were 7 of us there, she would take the candy bar, or whatever it was, and divide it into 8 chunks, eat one, and then rearrange the other 7 and bring them out. So she was getting a double portion each time. No wonder she was happy about it. And, we find this out years later, so this person we always kind of admired for her fairness and her selflessness had in fact been ripping us all off. But when we heard that story, I think every one of us just guffawed. We thought that was so funny that she pulled our leg like that. It was funny, right? Because we know that it wasn't coming out of meanness. It was really it was just a loving trick to play on a family member. We did that kind of stuff. Love covers a multitude of things, right? We don't worry about them. Another thing is rejoicing. The Bible tells us to rejoice so often, but rejoicing for the success of other people is really important. There's a passage in several passages in the New Testament that say this, but one of them is just, I had it down on my sheet, rejoice for the sake of others, from Romans. It tells us just to celebrate the success that people have. And if we do that, then we get rid of a lot of the resentment we have on that. In fact, we become part of this chain of success, which is a wonderful thing, right? I don't see them as my enemy. I see them as my friend, my family. I'm celebrating their successes in my life. That changes everything. And how about contentment? The Bible has a lot of passages that tell us that contentment and godliness is where we need to be at. The Apostle Paul writes and talks a lot about it. And he says that we should learn to be satisfied with the things we've been given. This is what he says in Philippians. He says, I'm not saying this because I'm in need, for I have learned to be content whatever the circumstances. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. So Paul writes the importance of just being content in all things. And you might say he's blowing smoke, but it's Paul. We do know he went through a lot and still found contentment and joy in all those things. Another thing we could do is fasting. We'll talk more about that next week, but fasting sort of tells us we're not entitled to everything. We don't have to have it all the time. We can learn to do without and without as much. All those things are peace and contentment and love and grace if they fill our hearts and they push out this envy and the power that it can have in our lives. So let's just close with a word of prayer. Lord Jesus, we thank you for your grace, which fills our hearts and lives and enables us to live in a different way. We pray that you will free us from a competitive comparing that gets in the way of our relationships with others. We don't want to be destructive in that way, but help us, we pray, to know your healing and wholeness and reconciliation at work in our lives. In Jesus' name, amen.